It's July 3rd. Tomorrow's Independence Day. So if you hear some explosions or gunfire or crazies on motorcycles and dirt bikes in the background, don't worry. It's just the way us country folk celebrate our freedom. It's a good reminder that freedom don't come free. There's a price to be paid for it. I hope people are understanding that nowadays, that sometimes you got to stand up against tyrannical governments. I want to tell a story today about an 8-pointer I hunted. This goes back to the 1990s, mid-90s, probably 93 or 94. I hunted the buck for 2 years. He was a pretty nocturnal buck, and it was an open area, and I couldn't quite get close enough to his bedding areas to get that daylight movement. I'd get glimpses of him, but I just couldn't get in that range, and I kept working and working. And it got to, rut time, and I started seeing a little more daylight movement, just enough to tease me, but he wasn't making it close enough. And then early November, and in that area, the rut really seemed to peak around November 3rd or 4th is when you get the best daylight movement over the years that I remember. And it was November 4th, and I was really starting to pick up on seeing him and seeing his sign in certain areas around certain bedding, and I felt I was getting close. And we were going to have a storm on the night of November 3rd. And it was going to be a heavy storm. And it was supposed to end around the middle of the night. Midnight 1, something in there. And it was going to be a downpour before then. And there's one thing I kind of learned about these bucks, is that on the nights that you get that downpour, and I mean if it's a heavy one, not a light rain or anything, but just a torrential thunderstorm, that those bucks would stay hunkered down. And then when the storm would end, they'd get a later start, and they'd make the rounds and get back to bedding a little later in the morning and maybe give you that daylight opportunity. So my plan was to get up 2 or 3 in the morning, head over to this place, get there around 4, go way back into this funnel and set up where it goes into bedding. I wasn't feeling all that great on the night of the 3rd. I was coming down with some sort of bug. And when I woke up in the middle of the night to go hunting, it was still raining. And then thunder and cracking, and I just felt like, well, it'll end by the time I get out there. But I really wasn't feeling good. Matter of fact, it kind of turned into a full-out flu. I was pretty sick. I even puked a couple times. And I was really not feeling good, but in those days I had that drive to kill that deer to the point where I was not going to miss that opportunity that I felt I would get out of that morning after the storm. So I pushed on. And I went to the spot, parked there. It was still raining, still downpouring, still thunder cracks in the sky. And there was a wind, and the rain was blowing sideways. And it was nasty, about as nasty a storm as you could imagine. And I grabbed my bow and I headed back. And it was just blasting thunder and pouring. And the rain was hitting me sideways, and I was so sick that the rain actually hurt when it hit my skin, blowing sideways. And I set up where a river took a bend. It was like an oxbow, but the outside of an oxbow. So we've talked about how deer bed on the inside of an oxbow. This oxbow had no bedding on the inside, just the way it was, didn't have the good cover. It had an outside oxbow that created a funnel. So deer going from here to bed would go around that oxbow and come up against a close road and have to go through a narrow funnel. And I knew from the past that was a good spot to cut deer off going to that bedding. It was probably 200 yards from the beds, but I really couldn't get any closer accurately. And in the morning you didn't want to be that close because they'd come in a little different every morning. They'd come out the same, but they'd use the wind going in. They'd smell their bedding areas. So I wanted to be in that funnel in the morning, catching them coming back, 200 yards back from the bed. I got in that tree and I sat there and I was sicker than a dog. And that storm just kept going. It didn't stop like they had predicted. So when legal light came, it started getting lighter, but it was still pretty dark out. There's still a little lightning in the sky, a little thunder. The rain had settled down a little bit, but it was still blowing sideways with the wind. And even at a drizzle, I was getting pelted pretty good. So I hid my face behind this big limb on this willow tree. And I was sitting there with my face blocked, and I couldn't hear much because everything was wet and because of the sound of the rain. And in my peripheral, I see movement, and I look over, and here comes the buck through my opening. And I had my bow down here, and I looked over, and I got my bow up, and I drew my bow as he's walking through my opening. I didn't have much of a window, and I shot that bow, and I remember the arrow going right through him, and watching it go into the water beyond in the river, and the deer bolting, and I just knew I had him. I watched him run out of sight, and I was so sick that right after he ran off, I puked. I bent over and started just puking, and I started shaking real bad. I had a full-blown flu going. I got down from the tree, I took my bow, and I walked back to the truck, and I was drenched, soaked. And this is November, it's not very warm out. A little colder than it would have been snow. I got into the truck, I drove home, and I just passed out. And I slept half the day, and I finally got up, still a little sick, went back, found the deer, dragged it out, and took pictures and stuff. That was a hell of a hunt. There's some real good lessons here to be learned on how I use that outside of an oxbow, how I use that storm to get those deer off schedule so they come back a little later. That's worked for me several times for morning hunts, even outside of the rut. Early season and late season, I've had deer activity very good the morning after a storm. Where normally mornings aren't that great for me, but those days are great. I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope there was a lesson or two there for you. And I hope you're enjoying your 4th of July. Remember to hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.
Ooh,
Don't be a catfish.
nice.